Now we have Gale Holland, who is not an ancient Greek philosopher. She is an award-winning journalist, however, who covers homelessness and poverty for the Los Angeles Times. She won a 2012 Investigative Reporting Award from the Neiman Foundation for a series about college construction abuses that she wrote with colleague Michael Finnegan. Her latest piece at the LA Times deals with the LAPD's rising arrests of homeless people. And in addition to the Los Angeles Times, Gale has worked for USA Today, LA Weekly, and more. Gale, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming on.
Certainly.
I have written for the LA Times. I know they have a different political stripe than I do, but they've always been incredibly fair to me, which is not true of every paper I've published in. So I've always admired them for that. I've read your pieces.
Very glad to hear that.
No, it really is. It really has been amazing. I've been reading your pieces on homelessness, and more than that, of course, I've been seeing what's going on in LA. I was in New York for Christmas, where the temperature was down below zero, and there were people out in the street, wrapped up in blankets. And I was sitting there just thinking, this ain't right. Something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. So let's start with this. The reason this bothers me so much is because it wasn't always like this. I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't like this. In one of your articles, you follow this back to the 80s. What happened?
Well, there was disinvestment and closure of mental institutions. But the effects of that from the 80s are kind of over. There was, more importantly, I think there was a huge disinvestment and actually urban renewal, slum clearance of public housing. And there just is a segment of the population that has never been able to compete in the regular housing market. And that's just super accelerated now because coming out of the recession, the rents here and in other places have shot way up. And while there's a lot of people who never recovered from the recession, from losing their homes or their jobs or medical bills or other things.
So first, before we go on with this, what's the situation now? I mean, it seems to me, just by the evidence of mine eyes, it seems to me that homelessness is now epidemic in LA. Is that fair to say?
Definitely. It's
Okay.
epidemic, and I think there are people here who've been involved in trying to solve the problem since the 80s, and they all, to a man and woman, say that it's the worst it's ever been.
So is that true? There's one line in one of your articles where you say that if you removed California, homelessness would be down in the rest of the country. Is that
right?
true?
Like the national figures for the first time went up this year nationally. Figures of total homeless population. But if you took LA out, the growth in LA, it actually wouldn't have gone up. It would have stayed steady. So LA is a huge contributor, driver of the whole national problem. And we also have the most homeless veterans, and which has been, there was a lot of effort made to deal with that as a national problem. But so far it's helped, but it hasn't worked.
So before we isolate this in California, you said that you felt that the closing down of the mental institutions from the 80s, that the effects of that had passed. Why do you feel that? Are the people on the street
what
not
I mean
home?
is that what I mean by that is that there are people, and there's a lot of them actually, who say Ronald Reagan closed mental hospitals, and that's why we have homeless people. Well, the people who were in the hospitals at that time are not with us anymore, by and large. So to look at one action or one politician like that, I think is way oversimplifying.
Okay.
I mean, at the same time, it's still a contributor because the funding never went into the alternatives for mental health. And Los Angeles has an unusually high, its homeless population, an unusually high segment of it is mentally ill people, which could be related to the fact that we also have, I believe, the most people who've been in the streets for a long time or been on and off the streets for a long time. I interviewed somebody last week who lived originally in a hole in the ground in a camp that they shut down last week for 30 years.
So in other words, if he wasn't mentally ill when he started, he would be now. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So why LA? Why California in general? I mean, what is going on now here that's
Well,
making this
I
problem
think
so
what's
bad?
going on now is that LA, more than other cities that have similar rents, such as New York and San Francisco, has always been more of a working class or even poor people's city. So the gap between the incomes here and the rents is the most extreme. More
Okay.
people here are paying, what's considered an unacceptably high portion of their income for rent. Also, the city has never gone into too much shelter development, and so we have 75% of the people who are homeless in LA County live outdoors, and that's not the case in other cities. So that's why the problem is just so extremely visible and also just extreme because, of course, living outside is terrible for everyone, for the people who are living like that and for the people who live around them.
I remember it was a long time ago, back in the 80s, there was a movement by people who fancied themselves rights activists saying that people had the right to live on the streets. They shouldn't be taken off the streets by police. They shouldn't be rounded up and put in shelters. Is that still going on?
Well, I think that the people in LA who are involved in services or trying to solve the homeless problem don't believe in forcible removal to shelters. The thinking now is that a lot of the problem with the shelters was that they were extremely unattractive to anyone. And I know one person said to me, I thought it was a good point, what kind of a shelter system do we have if people would prefer to lie in a doorway with a blanket to entering this shelter system? There's something wrong with the shelter system. Now they're trying to do a different kind of short-term housing while they try to get people into permanent housing. That's taking a long time to develop. There's going to be, and there already is, objections in various neighborhoods to having the shelters there. People who are way out in the suburbs, which there are camps all over the far-flung suburbs of LA County, are not going to go to Skid Row and go in a shelter. They're just as afraid of Skid Row as everybody else, or is repelled by Skid Row, depending on how you feel about Skid Row. But so I don't think anybody anymore that I know of feels that people need to be forcibly removed to shelters, that if they're provided without the barriers that kept people out of them in the past. And that's the thinking and the strategies that they're working toward. So like they're trying to get places for people, for example, to be able to bring their pets, because that's a huge barrier for some people, or to go into as a couple, because shelters in much of the housing is gender, is either all men or all women, and people in a couple don't want to split up. And then in the past, you had to kind of earn your way into housing by sobriety and following various rules. And now more and more the idea is get people into housing or shelter and then work on their sobriety and their other issues. So we'll see how that works.
So the idea is you wouldn't have to force people into shelters if the shelters were not so awful?
Yes.
Okay.
And if the shelters were not all centrally located in a place such as Skid Row, which is the most concentrated single homeless area in the country. There's can be 2,000 people sleeping on the streets. So
I understand when people talk about this, they want to build more housing. That makes perfect sense. You've got somebody on the street without a roof. You want to build a roof. But is there some larger systemic problem here that didn't exist before the 80s, besides the mental institutions? Is there something? I mean, unemployment is virtually non-existent right now. I mean, it's so low. Is there something we're not dealing with systemically that we should be?
Well, there's not enough, because there's not enough housing generally. The housing prices are so high and people's wages do not match those. So it's just a gap. It's a huge gap. And part of it is that as a society, we rejected public housing as an alternative. But I mean, I've lived in LA all my life. I know what my parents paid for their house, and sure, wages are higher now, and you'd have to adjust. But the cost of housing is so extreme in relation even to a professional income such as my own.
Yeah.
And such as my parents had. And I just am like one of the lucky LA people, and we all walk around talking about it all the time, who bought long enough ago that my house is worth a lot of money, and my mortgage is such that I can pay it.
Right.
Without a real problem. But again, because LA has always been, it's not like San Francisco and New York where there's like huge, I mean, the city itself, the especially in the downtown areas and the neighborhoods around downtown, there was lots of rental housing that was available to people at rates that were, even like 7 years ago, at rates that were not all that much higher than 17 years ago. But in those past years, since the recession ended, the rates are just phenomenal. They've gone from hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars.
So there's all this money, right? I believe that, I can't remember the numbers. It was a huge amount of dollars being poured into this problem. Have I got that right? Wasn't that something that was voted in?
Yeah, it's the voters approved two different measures that in aggregate are going to create $4.6 billion to build housing and provide services to homeless people. And basically right now what's going on is the thought is that that's going to take 3 years to really make any impact. So now they're kind of desperately trying to get some interim measures off the ground, including more shelter space, but again, trying to make the shelters such that people will prefer them to sleeping on the street. And they need to go out and find all these people that are living in these camps. And because LA County has a lot of riverbeds, believe it or not, even though we're always in a drought. Yeah. It's a really vast and varied kind of landscape.
So if you had to guess, and I won't obviously hold you to this prediction, 3 years from now, do you think it's going to be any better?
I think it'll be better, but I don't know how much better. Well, their goals, I think, are to get 50% of the people living in the streets off the streets, and that would be huge.
Right. Wow.
So in that sense, I mean, it's also what's better. Like, is better people not having to see encampments? That's certainly better for the people who are, and everybody in LA is extremely, extremely bothered by having camps in their neighborhoods. There's camps in Bel Air. There's camps in Beverly Hills. Well, not camps, but there's people living in their cars in Beverly Hills. There's nobody who's untouched by it right now.
I know, I do believe in the rights of the people in homes to not have these camps there, to not have to suffer from the crime, the disease, the filth that comes out of them. I do believe in their rights, but I'm also, I'm concerned. I mean, this shouldn't be happening here. It seems to me. I remember flying through actually passing through the slums of Nairobi many, many years ago and thinking there's nothing like this in the U.S. But now when I look at these places, that's what it looks like to me. It looks like Nairobi. And I think there's got to be, this is probably outside of your bailiwick, and if you can't answer, I totally understand. But if you're an ordinary person and you want to do something about this, is there any systemic thing that you would be looking at? I mean, is there an approach that an ordinary person or church should take to this? Or is it just kind of throwing starfish back in the sea, finding shelter for this one and that one?
Well, I think that the thing that the people that are in charge here right now are emphasizing, in fact, today they're doing this, is that neighborhoods have got to see, in their opinion, have got to see that allowing a shelter or an apartment for homeless people in their neighborhood, no matter how nice of a neighborhood they have or whatever, is a much better alternative to having a camp, a sidewalk camp, when you walk to the bus or whatever. And that's that's what they think will help, is if everybody in the city and county see that in their interests. And thus far, in the past year, there's been a lot of pushback and delays for housing projects because of people's objections.
Sure.
There's also a big issue about like where to put them, and again, that the idea being they're not all going to be in South Los Angeles, which is like where the poorest of the, or many of the poorest people in LA live, that they should be different places, because the people, again, who are in the camps in these neighborhoods, it's amazing when you talk to them how that they actually come right from that neighborhood. Like you go to a riverbed in Azusa and you go, well, where did you grow up? And they're like, well, I grew up 4 blocks away.
Right, because the price.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so
Gale,
I think that's the biggest thing, and also just to they're trying to coordinate and organize the whole thing, because it has been, as you said, the starfish methodology of, you know, there's a lot of people who, it's an amazing amount of people in Los Angeles who drive around with food and hand it out to people and bring, you know, warm clothing and all kinds of things, but that doesn't get people off the street.
It doesn't solve the problem. Gale Holland, I'm glad you're covering this for the Los Angeles Times. I hope you'll keep at it. And I really appreciate your coming on to talk about it, and I hope you'll come back.
Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. That's so frustrating, this thing, and it's like this vicious cycle, because once they're out in the streets, she's right. They, you know, that contributes to mental illness, contributes to drunken. Who wouldn't drink if you're out in the streets? But I also understand why somebody buys a house in Bel Air and says, you know, I paid a lot of money for this place. I don't want these. You know, I'm going to meet with a guy who today, I'm going to have coffee with a guy who has an association in West Hollywood, where basically I am, and talk to him about it too. I just think it's amazing. It doesn't entirely make sense to me. I don't feel like I have a grasp on this. I understand that the housing situation is bad, but it seems to me that there's a social situation here that is also a problem.